Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's the last Thursday of the month once again, and we are here to share with you some great news about what's going on with Gawad Kalinga. And we have a special guest this evening who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, let me start with just a few highlights of what has been happening in the past month. First of all, congratulations to our GK team in Chicago for a successful event with Father Ben Nebres, the longtime president of Ateneo University. I think he's the one who was served as president for the longest, right? And so he visited Chicago last weekend and shared with us some of his personal experiences working with Gawad Kalinga. And from the pictures that we saw on Facebook, as you probably have seen already, it was a really successful event, and we're looking forward to a great harvest for our GK Chicago team. Also, the Bayani Challenge that Gawad Kalinga Philippines launched back in April has concluded. So for the past 3 months, it's a 3-month long event, right? Where Gawad Kalinga gathered volunteers from across the country and even, from different countries outside the Philippines, and to come together in the spirit of Bayanihan and had some building activities in GK site. So for the past 3 months, we've had 28,459 Bayanis or heroes or heroines from 62 locations who have performed 20 acts of kindness and service to their communities. Volunteers, mostly led by youth groups, have taken the charge in feeding, teaching, cleaning, planting, and engaging with the poor. As we made the call to serve, many have responded, and this gives us hope that the spirit of Bayanihan will carry us through tough times. All right. So the other thing that I wanted to announce also is that we've been receiving some offers from producers of concerts to have Gawad Kalinga USA as their beneficiaries. So if that's something that, if there's a producer out there or anyone who's looking for a beneficiary for your fundraising event, we hope that you would consider Gawad Kalinga USA as your beneficiary. So please visit our website at gk-usa.org for information on how to contact us and how to get that started. And we look forward to partnering with you and, in this movement to eradicate poverty in the Philippines. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. So Dr. Matthew Koschmann, there we go. I was going to prompt you to turn a video. You're right there on target, right? All right. So Dr. Koschmann is an associate professor at University of Colorado, Boulder. And he's been doing a lot of research for nonprofits in the Philippines. And it's specifically their response to typhoons or natural calamities that hit the islands, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? First of all, can I call you Dr. Koschmann? Is that a little too formal, or should I call you Matt, or how do you want to be addressed?
Oh, I think Matt would be fine for our purposes today. Right, Thank you for having me.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit about your research that you've been doing in the Philippines?
Yeah, so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. My connection to the Philippines through some of these research projects actually has been quite accidental, but also quite serendipitous. And it's just been wonderful to develop these connections. Years ago, through no planning on my part, I got connected with a group of engineering professors and graduate students here at our university who have a special program in their civil engineering school centered on humanitarian engineering, basically studying various engineering practices in response to natural disasters, calamities, typhoons, earthquakes, things like that. But as anyone who has worked in that space knows, it's never just an engineering problem. There's always, in addition to the technical and scientific and physical material problems, there's all kinds of social, cultural issues that come along with that. It's never just rebuilding a structure, it's always rebuilding communities. And so this humanitarian engineering program really wanted to expand to have much more of a sociological, cultural, psychological, social science approach to things. And that's kind of how I got connected. I'm a professor in the communication department, and communication is a little bit of everything, a little bit of sociology, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of culture. And so to make an incredibly long story very short for these purposes, I was invited to be part of a research team studying some of these issues. We received some multi-year grants from our National Science Foundation, which is a big research funder here in the United States. And we began our efforts studying a lot of the rebuilding efforts after Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda back in 2013. Now, I was a little bit more of a support person on this project. I did not travel to the Philippines. I had no real connections, but I was just assisting our graduate students with research design and things like that. But fast forward a little bit to 2018 when I was on sabbatical at my university. So basically we get a research semester. We get a semester off of teaching to pursue research projects. And my wife and I had always wanted to do something internationally. This is our chance to get out of the country and to see the world. And when I thought about, well, where do I have professional connections internationally, it really was the Philippines because of this previous couple years of connections to these research projects. So, you know, on a bit of a long shot, I applied for a Fulbright Scholars Fellowship in the Philippines at Ateneo de Manila University in Quezon City. And to my wildest surprise, I was granted that fellowship. And so my family and I were off to Manila, for a 5-month stay in Quezon City to be a visiting research professor at Ateneo University there in Quezon City. And I've returned to the Philippines a couple times in 2020, right before the pandemic kicked in. And then most recently, just a few weeks ago in June for another 2-week trip. But basically my research has focused on issues of housing, whether that has to do with housing reconstruction after natural disasters, or urban issues of urban housing, especially relocating informal settlement communities, whether it's people off of the waterways or other dangerous, precarious situations, and how they work with governments, nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations to secure safe and stable housing and to relocate their communities into those housing projects. Now, of course, those are all very big topics with lots of specifics behind them, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But that's the 30,000-foot overview of my research and my involvement in the Philippines.
So, but what brought you to Gawad Kalinga? Who introduced you to the organization, and how did you, I guess, become interested in working with Gawad?
Yeah. Well, like just about everything with my connections with the Philippines, it was quite accidental and utterly fantastic. So when we lived in Quezon City, for those of you who might be familiar with the area, we were just outside the University District, down Commonwealth Avenue. If anybody's been stuck in traffic on Commonwealth, you certainly would never forget it. We lived in a neighborhood there where some friends of ours in the United States had a house. Their parents had a house that was available that we could rent. So we stayed in the neighborhood there, and we got to be great friends with a family in the neighborhood where our children went to the same school, a multiple intelligence international school in Quezon City, just up the block on Katipunan from Ateneo University. And as we just got to know each other, and I talked about the work I was doing with nonprofit organizations, poverty relief, housing, and lots of other issues, this family told me about Gawad Kalinga. And just that, hey, if you're interested in those kinds of issues in the Philippines, right. So they said, you got to check them out. And as an early entry, they said, you should start with human nature. And I know there's a fascinating connection and relationship between GK and human nature. And there's actually one of the flagship stores of human nature is on Commonwealth Avenue, in between Ateneo University and where we live. So we stopped there a couple of times and purchased a number of products and really enjoyed that and got to know a little bit more about the business model and how Human Nature, through their social enterprise, or really just commercial enterprise, supports the efforts of GK. And in fact, when we returned home, we filled up pretty much a whole suitcase full of Human Nature products, many of which we still continue to have and use. And when I was in the Philippines just a few weeks ago, I stopped at the GK store in the UP Diliman area, right near my hotel, and stocked up on a few supplies there. So that began our initial connection to GK. But as we learn more about Human Nature and its commercial support of GK, and then just what is happening with the overall endeavor and enterprise of GK, I just became more and more fascinated, learning more about enchanted farms, learning more about the villages that are built. Here at the University of Colorado, I teach a class in nonprofit organizational communication, and we do a unit on social enterprise and international nonprofit work. And we do a deep dive into GK, and we study many of the aspects of the GK model. We show some of the videos from GK and the Enchanted Farm and Human Nature. And so I've just developed a great affinity and connection with GK. And even just most recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was at GK headquarters in the southern Manila area, just to meet with the chairman of the board and the executive director and some of the other staff to see the new building. And then as part of the research trip that we were on a few weeks ago in the Cavite area, Cavite province, we also spent a day in the GK village in Das Marinas. We spent the whole day there talking to people. We had dinner, we sang karaoke, we didn't spend the night, but we stayed late into the night and just had a wonderful time. So I've had just a wonderful connection with GK in a number of different ways.
So what is your go-to karaoke song? I want to know before I go on to my 10,000 questions.
Well, as anybody who's heard me sing in church or elsewhere knows, I've got a pretty limited range, but there's about a 3-note range I can hit pretty well. And so the key is to find singer-songwriters who don't expand much. And probably one of my go-to people is Johnny Cash, who sings right in my range and stays within about a 3 notes. So Ring of Fire, Johnny Cash is probably my go-to song because I can pretty much hit every note.
There you go. Well, Johnny Cash. I love Johnny Cash. All right. So Marisol Villanueva, who you've met a couple of times.
Yes.
At least most recently, just a few months ago, right? During your last visit. She said
yes.
that you said GK fascinates you, I quote, there is something special happening in the GK communities. What did you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. What was really impressive to me as I've gotten to learn more about the GK villages and the housing projects and the model for housing is that even though housing is very central and is very foregrounded, especially if you've been to a GK village and seen the beautiful colors and landscaping, it's about so much more than just the physical structures and building the houses, which unfortunately is what many housing projects are all about. That was a key part of my research, is to see, unfortunately, the failures of many government housing programs that just build physical structures and just do not attend much to the socio-economic, cultural, spiritual needs of the community members themselves. And so what really stood out to me and continues to stand out to me about the GK model is that they're not just building houses, they're building community. And they're not just building physical structures and then having people inhabit them. The people themselves are building the physical structures. They're helping each other build. Not everybody can put in the kind of sweat equity that is required for a GK housing project, but I was fascinated to talk with so many people who offered their time and energy to put in the sweat equity for other people. So for example, mothers with young children who are not able to work on the houses themselves, other community members would do the work for them. And so you're already building a sense of community among the participants long before anybody moves in. The way they do programs of value formation in ways that really impart the spirit of GK, not just the technical structures of the houses. The way in which the community values are reinforced. I was just really struck in our time in the GK village in Das Marinas. It got kind of into the evening, we had dinner together, and we just went outside the main hall and just saw people were playing basketball, people were playing volleyball, the kids were running around. I mean, it just felt like you were in the midst of a community, not just a housing project. And so there's something special about GK and their emphasis on building community, not just building houses.
So, considering your background, of as you mentioned, you teach communications, right? How does GK's model or approach in eradicating poverty from a communication standpoint, I guess, is different from maybe other non-profits trying to make a difference in maybe ending poverty or whatever other cause that or advocacies they might have. But how does Gawad Kalina's communication approach will be different?
Yeah, one of the key things that stands out to me is the way in which GK is quite invitational in their communication, that they are drawing people into not just particular facts and figures, although those are important, but they're drawing them into a particular story. In the field of communication, we often talk about something named narrative rationality, and we contrast that with what might be considered more of a rational world paradigm. So a rational world paradigm talks about convincing people through facts and figures and argumentation and logic and reasoning and things like that. And of course, that is all very important. We need good reasoning. We need true facts and figures. We need to be able to assess our programs. But in many ways, that should support the bigger picture. Many people are not drawn into or are persuaded deep in their soul by those kinds of things. Instead, it's the power of story. It's drawing people into the narrative. And what I see working really well from GK is the emphasis on narrative, on story, on the lived experiences of people. Yes, GK does wonderful work with their facts and figures. And I spent time at the headquarters, and I can assure you, they have a robust accounting department. They have their fingers on every little penny. They know where everything is. They've got great plans. They're doing a lot of great stuff behind the scenes, but that's not the thing that moves people to support, to bring them into the story of GK. But rather, GK leads with narrative, leads with story. When we were there, I was just, when we were at the GK village in Das Marinas, for example, I was just overwhelmed with the stories that people told, not just the technical specifications or the facts and figures of the village. So that's one thing that really stands out to me, is that GK leads with story, and they compel people like me by inviting us into that narrative to find our place in the story. Even somebody like me who lives halfway across the world, but I can resonate with the experiences of people, and I can be drawn into the story that they are living.
So you said you visited the Philippines twice already. Is that all research, or is there anything, I mean, is that a continuing research that you're doing, or was there any other purpose of the?
Yes, primarily, but I always sneak in a few other things. So, I was there for our sabbatical semester for 5 months in 2018, but I was able to return as part of our ongoing research in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And then obviously the restrictions locked everything down, and the Philippines had a pretty strict lockdown, as I've come to learn. But those restrictions have lifted. So I've been back again just a few weeks ago for 2 weeks in June as part of ongoing research projects. But I always like to tack on a couple days at the end to visit friends that we've had there. And we also have another special connection. The first time we were there, my wife spent a lot of time volunteering for a nonprofit organization that works in the Payatas community in northern Quezon City, with a child sponsorship and educational and health provision program. And we came to really appreciate that organization, and we actually decided to sponsor a young girl and her family as part of that program. That started in 2018, and we've continued doing that ever since. And so the last 2 times I've also taken some time to visit our sponsored child. Her name is Charlene, and her family. One time we went up to the Payatas village and just spent the afternoon with her and her family. And this most recent time, we actually got together with her and several of her friends, and we went to the Mall of Asia to watch a movie in the theaters that none of her or her friends had ever seen a movie in the theaters. So we went and saw the movie Lightyear, which was just wonderful. And the kids had a great time. And they were just, as you can imagine, if anybody's been to the Mall of Asia, right there in downtown Manila, right on the coast, it's a pretty impressive place. It's very big. There's a lot going on. The kids were just very impressed with everything that they saw. So we just had a wonderful time together with Charlene, who we sponsor, and several of her friends, just going out to dinner, going to movies, spending time in the mall, riding on some of the rides. So anytime I go for a research project, if I'm able, I like to sneak in a little extra time to visit friends and support our sponsor family.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. Now you make me want to go back to the Philippines because I miss all those places you just mentioned. Or maybe one of the things you mentioned, I have not even been able to visit when I was there. The last time I was in the Philippines was, I think, 2017. So it's been 5 years that I hadn't gone home.
Yeah.
Ben, you've been to the Philippines more than I've been. All right. Well, before we to read this message from one of the friends you made over there, it looks like. Hang on one second. Yeah, this one is from Chrissy Saplala. She says, "Hi, Matt. Nice to share. Nice to see you share your GK experience and your insights here in Quantum GK. Incidentally, I think I have a short video of the karaoke." So,
oh boy, that could be trouble.
I suppose with you singing, right? So that could go viral. Maybe Chrissy can make some money off of that.
Well, I keep your day job if you're looking for money. But yes, that was a wonderful evening together. And thank you for logging on. That was fully consensual. So I know that wherever the video ends up, so be it. I'm glad we had a good time together.
I'm pretty sure, the GK family is pretty, very loving and very, how do I say, loving and fun loving. So
absolutely,
we'll appreciate it. So how many GK villages have you seen or visited? From, I guess, for your work or just for curiosity that you visited?
Well, for our ongoing research project, just one village in depth in Das Marinas, which is in kind of the south central Cavite province. We've driven by a few others just to look and just to see. I've also looked up some things online and tried to study as much as I could from a distance. There's actually a GK Colorado village in northern Luzon. I hope to visit someday, but I know it's sponsored by many Filipino Americans who have relocated to here in Colorado and are part of the American Colorado diaspora. And I know many years ago that they supported a GK village in northern Luzon called GK Colorado. I have not visited there. Hopefully that'll be on my next trip, but really only one village in depth, spending a lot of time there, basically the whole day. Everything else has been kind of drive-by or learning what I can online.
So do you remember the very first GK village you visited, even, just that maybe brief visit, just the first time you've ever seen the GK village? Do you remember what your impression was or what came to mind when first time you saw people in that community?
Yeah, well, I imagine it's probably the same as everybody else's first time seeing a GK village. It's the color and the aesthetics and the beauty. And the landscaping and the flowers and the trees. I think there's something really special about the way in which GK focuses on beauty and aesthetics. And as somebody who's been to several other housing projects from different organizations and from the city and the National Housing Authority, I can tell you the GK villages really, really stand out in that regard. Also, just the number of people you will see around who are talking to their neighbors, they're playing with their children and their friends. And so right away, I think I like many other people who encounter a GK village for the first time, are really struck by the beauty, the aesthetics, the color, the visual appeal, and the spirit of community amongst the people.
And in contrast, I wonder, I'm just curious to know, have you visited any I guess, slum community that GK has not helped or has not touched. Did you get a chance to visit any of those, like the squatters and,
Yes, many. I've actually spent quite a decent amount of time in many informal settlement communities, especially during my time in 2018 when I was here connected to Ateneo. That's what I did a lot of my time is I just hopped in a taxi or an Uber and I had some connections with people and we just spent the day in various communities talking with people about their experiences. This last trip that I was on in Cavite province, we were doing an assessment for a United Nations program in a couple communities in Kawit and Bacoor. And we were connecting with people in some of those informal communities who had engaged in a microfinance program to help repair and rebuild some of their housing structures. So yes, I certainly have, and it's quite an experience to see the level of poverty that pervades many communities in the Philippines, but also a spirit of resilience and optimism and hope amongst many of the people. You know, as I've talked to many people, both in the Philippines and back here in the United States, what really strikes me about the Philippines is it's a nation of contrasts. There's so much contrast from the wealth and glitz of Makati and the informal settlement communities that are right there in the shadows of all the skyscrapers and four-star hotels. And you see that contrast in effect when you visit many of the informal settlement communities. The degradation of many of the structures that people have to live in, the conditions of squalor and poverty, but just the hope and the optimism in the community that exists among the people. It's quite the contrast, and it's quite the experience.
We have a couple more comments here saying hi to you from the Forest. She says, thanks for sharing your experience in GK Philippines. Mabuhay.
Yes, mabuhay.
Yeah, from Luz Ruby Bernardo Chase. Dr. Matt should visit Valenzuela City, housing and bridges to prosperity program. Includes urban farming, very similar to GK. I guess it's another. I don't know if that's another nonprofit or it's another housing program. It's like
that's a great comment. I'm certainly always looking to learn and experience more. So thank you for that.
So you mentioned the contrast and all of this. I'm going to share a little story. I went to Miriam College, which is right next to Ateneo, as you might know.
Yes, of course.
And we lived in Esteban Abada and B. Gonzales, right at the corner, that corner street. That's where I lived when I was in college, and I would walk to school, right, when I attend my classes. But outside, that's Loyola Heights, right? That's the subdivision, that's the committee of Loyola Heights, and then you have La Vista, right next to Miriam.
Yeah.
La Vista, right?
I can picture it vividly in my mind. Yes.
So now
yes.
So I'm going to date myself now. I just turned 50 2 weeks ago. So that was mid 90s when I lived there and went to college there. And, I remember just like you said, the contrast, right? Where, you live in a nice neighborhood, decent neighborhood, right? And you have the comforts of life and everything. And as soon as you get out of the village, you see poverty, right?
Yeah.
But then, even though I was already involved in the Office for Social Concern in college back in the day, for most people, poverty is just part of the landscape, right? The informal settlements that you're talking about are just part of the landscape. So, with Gawad Kuning, I'm really very happy to be part of this movement and do just whatever, little contribution I can give. Because it gives me hope, like you said, that it poverty should not be part of the landscape. It should be something that
right.
expressed, and and all of us have a part in bringing the Philippines out of poverty. And we thank you for your work and your interest in, in Gawad Kalinga, and, and in our country, you could have chosen. I know you said that, you, you immediately linked into your already existing professional connections, but you could have tried other countries as well, and you could have visited. You could have brought your work, your research into other countries that also need help, but you chose the Philippines, and so we're very blessed for that.
Well, I think in many ways the blessing is all mine. So yes, things have been quite accidental, but I prefer the term providential. I think God is working to bring all things together for the good of those who are our followers and believers. And in many ways, that some of these things that are quite accidental and circumstantial, you look back and you see how all the dots are connected and how things happen for a reason. So in many ways, I can't explain things. In many ways, it doesn't make sense, but I think that's the beauty of these sorts of connections. I have developed an unexplainable, irrational affinity for all things Filipino, especially the beautiful people of the Philippines. And I just look forward to more connections, more visits, more travel, and just anything I can do to be supportive and helpful. I'm honored to be involved.
Thank you for that. Well, I wanted to ask you about what you think. We always say that poverty in the U.S. and poverty in the Philippines are two completely different things. What's your view about that? Obviously, being born and raised, I guess, in the U.S., right? And you're with the poverty here. How is poverty in the Philippines different from the poverty here in the U.S.?
Wow, that is a big question with, I think, a lot of complicated answers. But I think there's at least a few things we can talk about, at least from a high level, that can be explored elsewhere. Probably one of the biggest differences are the structural conditions that lead to poverty. So many of the issues related to poverty in the Philippines they're just different. So than title, the way land is allocated, the way in which modern Philippines is in many ways a product of many of the geopolitical decisions that were made after World War II. And the Philippines and the United States had very, very different post-World War II experiences. The United States was very involved in World War II, but really nothing happened on our soil, despite some reconnaissance efforts by the Germans and the Japanese on both of our coasts. We weren't, and of course, the devastation of Pearl Harbor. But the mainland United States was not affected. Contrast that with the Philippines, which was absolutely decimated by the events of World War II. And the way in which the Philippines rebuilt after World War II, both in terms of its geography and its politics and its land reform issues, many aspects of poverty in the Philippines are a result of the ripple effects of some of those decisions. The way political leaders have led and governed in our different countries. Many of those are just, we don't have parallels. So when we think of what has happened in the Philippines throughout the 20th century, very different than the United States. So just a very different geopolitical environment. Second thing would be the climate. The Philippines sits on the Ring of Fire, as it's infamously called, and just deals with a culture of disaster, as a famous book is titled, where it experiences natural calamities and hazards in ways that we just don't in the United States. And that has a devastating effect on people's livelihoods, housing, well-being. So there's lots of structural factors that are just very, very different. The other issue would be the economic factors. It's just apples and oranges, the economic conditions, the way in which the American economy works versus the Filipino economy. Plenty of overlap, but lots of differences. Obviously, there's disparities in wealth. I was thinking about this just today. I was sending some money to the Philippines via PayPal for some of the graduate student research assistants from Ateneo who worked with me. And when I send my money via PayPal, there's always the conversion rate. And it's just a very stark contrast between the Filipino peso and the American dollar. So very, very different economic conditions. So those are probably, those are very big, high macro level factors that have lots of different implications for different people in different communities in different ways. But the structural, geopolitical conditions and the economic conditions are incredibly different. At the same time, there are a lot of similarities in people's conditions and the way people, in many ways, are the products of their environments, the way in which structural socioeconomic factors have backed people into a corner, that there are people who are born with privilege and there are people who are born with disadvantage in both of our countries in many similar ways. So those are some of the similarities as well, despite the stark contrasts.
In relation to that, Chrissy Saplala has a question for you. Dr. Matt, what do you think will help the nonprofits move forward, especially after the perils of the COVID pandemic?
Wow, big question. And it's the question that so many people in the nonprofit sector are asking, both here in the United States and in the Philippines. I think one of the biggest things that we're going to see, my prediction would be a stronger move towards notions of social enterprise and hybrid organization. And what I mean by that is there, especially here in the United States, there's been a very robust discussion over the last 5-10 years in the nonprofit community about the place and value of social enterprise, meaning when nonprofits engage in commercial activity that is intended to support the social mission of the nonprofit organization, whether that's a commercial enterprise that is directly connected to the nonprofit and is part of the nonprofit operation, or something that operates outside of the nonprofit but is committed to supporting those efforts. Human Nature would be one of those things. Human Nature is a commercial enterprise, but as part of its bylaws and rules of operation and norms of operation supports the mission of GK. There are some people in the nonprofit community who are very uncomfortable with that think that what we need to do is really redouble our efforts and our nonprofit commitment and not be so entangled with commercial activity. You know, it's a robust debate. I'm not sure there's a great answer, but I think what we're going to see is more of a need to shore up our financial stability. And that's got to expand beyond annual fundraisers, individual donations, and perhaps things more like steady and stable commercial activity. I think that'll be probably one of the bigger changes that we'll see coming out of the pandemic. Probably the second biggest change would be the use of technology and the need to incorporate, things like this, meeting and having these sorts of discussions via Zoom, Facebook Live, and all sorts of online platforms as becoming much more normal part of daily operations, just because we don't know when we're going to be restricted from meeting together, and it also opens up opportunities for people to connect and interact in ways that we just haven't been able to before, and that enables us to include more people, both in our organizations and as part of our larger communities and nonprofit efforts. So those are probably the two biggest trends I would predict are going to have some of the biggest impact on the nonprofit sector going forward.
I guess this will be my last question. It's 7:40, 20 minutes before 8 p.m. I don't want to keep you from joining your family I know you're traveling right now with your family. But why should people here in the U.S., Filipino or non-Filipino, why should they support Gawad Kalinga? Why should they contribute or be part of the movement?
Well, the simplest and most significant reason is because it works. I mean, it's a proven model. And I'll expand on that briefly. I mean, as we think about all the attempts and efforts at international aid, at poverty alleviation, at housing reform, there is a graveyard of failed programs throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. Some of it is well-intended, and we've learned from our mistakes, but a lot we know doesn't work. And what we what I've certainly seen and what many others have certainly seen is that GK works. The model of building communities, not just houses, the way in which values formation has got to be central to community development. The way in which everything from aesthetics and beauty and visual appeal is part of a community just as much as the finances and the roads and the plumbing and the infrastructure. The way to think holistically about community development, the way to develop sound financial structures from multiple sources, not just in the Philippines through individual donors, but corporate supporters, social enterprise, commercial endeavors, donors here in the United States, a vibrant community through GK USA. It's a proven track record and it's working. I mean, I certainly can speak from firsthand experience visiting GK villages and talking with the people involved. It is working and it's changing people's lives. So if you're the kind of person who wants your support, your energy, your resources, your finances to make a difference in the world, of course, there are many wonderful organizations and enterprises that are making a difference in many communities, not just in the Philippines, but across the United States and the world. But of course, we all have limited resources and we can't do everything. If you want to do one thing well, GK is a place to do that because it works and you know that your support will be making a tangible difference.
Awesome. Wow. That's amazing. And thank you for validating GK's work. And I'm pretty sure, everyone who, volunteers their time and, their tireless efforts, especially the people on the ground volunteering their time to, to mobilize and organize and build, right? I'm pretty sure that's something that just energized them, inspired them even more. From Maricel Villanueva, she says, thank you, Matt. Valenzuela is in Bulacan, north of Manila. Luz Ruby, GK
yes.
for its strong partnership with the city of Valenzuela, especially for our anti-hunger program and also other municipalities for health and shelter interventions. And then Luz Ruby Bernardo Chase says, Maricel, I agree. I love the partnership. Dr. Matt should see the results of that partnership. Great outcomes. And then she also says, agree.
I look forward to seeing it sooner than possible. Yes.
All right. Well, at this point, I can't tell you how much I'm geeking out right now. I'm actually a little bit nervous because my background is in communication and I was just really excited to learn from you. Communication, Gawad Kalinga, both of my passions. With you as a guest tonight, it just really excites me and thrills me no end. But where can people catch you? Do you have a YouTube channel or are you on social media? Do you have anything that where people can catch a little bit more of your work?
Absolutely. So I'm a little bit of a lagger on some of the social media stuff. I have a modest presence on Facebook, but that's probably about it. I do have a YouTube channel called CommProf Productions. So Comm for communication, Prof for professor, COMMPROF, CommProf Productions. And what I have there is a lot of educational videos, a lot of animation videos that bring some of my work on communication to life. And in particular, there's a video on that channel about natural disaster reconstruction and our research in the Philippines. It's about a 5-6 minute video, gives a nice overview of the work we've been doing. And we work with a great animator, producer who makes some wonderful films. So I would encourage you to check that out. Otherwise, I've got a good old fashioned website through the university. So if you just Google my name, Matthew Koschmann, I tend to be one of the first people that comes up. If you want to poke around on my website, I've got links to my research, links to research publications if you're interested in going a little bit deeper.
All right. And we will type the link to CommProf Productions on the chat box on this of this video, and also put in type in the link to your website with the University of Colorado. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Koschmann, and go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to say you're welcome. The pleasure's been all mine. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, our GK family and friends. This has been another episode of Quantum GK. Please join us again next month, last Thursday of August. I don't have the date, so just look at your calendar. And for some great announcements, great updates, and also another special guest. Good night, everyone.